Hello art friends, it's your girl Anoosha Syed here, your resident illustrator extraordinaire, and today we are going to be talking about contracts. Whenever you work on a project with a client, even if it's something small, you always need to have a contract in place. I don't care if you're making a quick 10-minute logo for your best friend's neighbor's cupcake business. You need to protect yourself. Contracts are designed to protect your work and to establish ground rules for the project that you're working on, so that there aren't any misunderstandings later on about the schedule, what materials you have to submit to the client, payment, copyright, and so on. However, I know that for a lot of artists, especially when you're first starting out, contracts can seem a little confusing. All of that legal language feels really intimidating, and you want to make sure that you're not missing anything out. In this video, I'm going to list out some things that you should be including in your next illustration contract, and I'm going to explain why each of those points are important to make sure you're ready for the next project that you work on. And at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about some of the questions that my followers sent me, talking about what red flags to look out for in a contract, what to do if a client goes against your contract, and what to do if you want to make changes to the agreement. I've included all of the timestamps below in case you want to skip ahead to, the stuff that's interesting to you. And if you do learn something today, consider giving this video a like and subscribe to my channel. I post tons and tons of videos on what it's like working in the illustration industry and my life as a picture book illustrator. Finally, big disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an agent. I'm just a silly little artist making videos based off of my own experiences as a freelance children's book illustrator. In the effort to make this video as simple and accessible to everyone as possible, I'm not going to cover any of the heavy legal stuff because that's just not my area of expertise. And this basic contract is mostly going to be for general illustration use. If you need a contract with a lot more protections, please do your research or get your contract checked by an actual lawyer. I'm going to include some resources at the end of the video that you can check out for more in-depth research. With that all out of the way, let's go. What is a contract? Before we talk about what to put into a contract, I want to explain what a contract even is and why having a contract at all is important, even for the little jobs. First of all, technically, agreements don't always have to be a written document. They can also come in the form of a verbal agreement with the client or even your email exchange with them. Those are still valid forms of contracts and are legally binding. However, if you ever have to go to court, it can be harder to prove exactly what terms were agreed on or if an agreement even exists at all. So it's always safer to have a written contract, which is what we're talking about today. As I said already, a contract is a document signed by both parties that is written proof of your agreement. It lists out the exact details of the project and the relationship between you and the client. A contract can look completely different depending on the type of project that you're working on. Editorial illustration contracts will look different from publishing, which look different from licensing, which look different from casual commissions, and so on, and it all depends on what the needs actually are. For example, the publishing contracts that I see for my picture books are usually very long and intensive since they have a lot more details to cover, like royalties and subrights and promotion. And I'm also dealing with an international mega corporation with big fancy lawyers. But that doesn't mean that all contracts have to be dense and confusing and full of big legal words. You can write it out more simply, especially if it's for your general illustration use. In fact, it is ideal that the contract is as clear as possible so that your client can actually understand what they're agreeing to. So, why have a contract? Why can't I just jump straight into my next new project? I trust the client and I don't want to make this complicated or scare them away. Well, number one, because I love numbered lists. Number one, a contract specifies all of the exact details of the project, including the schedule, what you have to deliver, the rights, the deadlines, as well as smaller details specific to the project. For example, on a picture book, this could include details like artist credit, royalties, publicity, and how many copies of the final book you would receive. Number two, because you have all the details, you and the client can always refer back to the contract and avoid any miscommunications about the work or process or payment later on. You both agreed to it and the proof is right there. Number three, on that same note, it also avoids the artist from working outside of the agreed scope. If the client asks you for a teeny tiny fourth illustration that shouldn't take any time at all, You can point to the contract and remind them that you only agreed to 3 illustrations and you'd have to be paid accordingly for any additional work. 4. It clearly explains the payment structure. What you're being paid, when, how, and in how many installments. Number 5, it includes protections for the artist, like kill fees and late fees, to make sure that you get paid fairly and on time. 6. If the client wants to make any significant changes to the project, or if the project isn't working out and either of you have to terminate it, you have clear guidelines on how it should be handled. No mess, no drama. 7. If any disagreements occur, or if the client goes against the contract, you have written proof of what was agreed on, which is extremely important if you need to take legal action and go to court. And number 8, having a contract is a sign of your professionalism and capability as a working illustrator, similar to investing in a domain name for your portfolio. It just looks good, and it is a clear sign to the client that you are serious and you know what you're doing. Without a contract, you risk being taken advantage of, not being paid, having your work stolen or used improperly, and God knows what else. On that note, if you have a client who refuses to work with a contract, I would see that as a huge red flag. And I would actually avoid working with them since it clearly shows that they don't have good intentions. If you are working with a larger client, they will likely have their own standard or boilerplate company contract that they send to all of their artists. However, it's important to understand that whoever is creating the contract will always write it in their favor. So, a boilerplate is designed to benefit the client as much as possible, which in turn might take advantage of the artist instead. Remember that contracts are flexible documents, and you always have the option to negotiate them so that the terms benefit you as well. If you're interested in learning more, I made a video all about negotiation for artists, which covers contract negotiation tactics, which I'll link to below. If the client doesn't provide you with a contract, then it is your job to create one for the project. It's also important that you have the contract signed before you do any of the work for the client. Sometimes, the contract negotiation process can be slow and the client might be itching to get started. But I strongly discourage you guys from creating any work until all of the paperwork is done. It is a pretty big red flag if the client is urging you to start working early. Unfortunately, I've definitely heard of stories where people will start working on a project before the contract is fully signed, but then, for some reason, the project falls through, and then, the artist isn't compensated for the work they completed already. Now that we have all of the whys and hows out of the way, we are going to get into what you need in your illustration contract. For this example, I'm going to create a contract for an illustrated poster for a music festival. Let's go. Description. Here you would include all of the necessary details about the project you're working on. Specify the services you're providing and what exactly you are delivering to the client. Basically, what is the final product your client will receive? Be as clear as you can here so there aren't any misunderstandings over what the client would expect to receive, or to avoid them asking for more or changing the deliverable. Here you can include details on the medium, the size, the format, and literally anything else that would be relevant. If the project is made up of several phases, like a character design stage, sketches, color, exploration, mock-ups, and so on, you might include that too. If you have concept stages where you have to show a few options for sketches or color, you might also want to specify how many options for approval you'll provide. So that way, when you're sending your initial sketches over, your client won't be expecting 25 different ideas when you had only planned to send out 3. For example, in my description for my music festival poster, I might write that artists will illustrate a full color poster and typography for the Evergreen Music Festival. And below that, I'll list out my deliverables, including each stage and the details of the final file. Deliverables. 3 to 5 black and white sketch concepts for approval. 2 color concepts for approval. Layered PSD file of final artwork at 11 by 13 inches and 300 dpi. Schedule. It's important to lay out the schedule of the project, especially if there are several stages involved in the process. At the very least, you should have a start and end date for the project. But if there are several stages that need approval, it's helpful to include the delivery dates for those as well. For example, in picture books, I usually have a delivery date for the sketches, the revisions, color roughs, and then the finals. If you expect feedback and approvals from the client, it could be a good idea to include feedback dates for the client to follow as well. This is going to make sure that the client doesn't take too long to give you notes, which would end up cutting into your schedule and give you less time to work on the rest of the project. If the client is late on giving you feedback, you now have the justification to ask for an extension on your work and change the schedule so you have more time to work on it. Or if the client still wants the project done on time, then they would need to pay a rush fee to make up for it. So as an example, this is what my schedule could look like. Here you can see I have my start date, and then I start off having individual delivery dates for each of my stages, including these sketches, as well as showing feedback dates for the client as well. Client agrees to approve submissions and give feedback before the agreed deadlines. Failure to give timely responses will require an extension to the final art deliveries or an additional rush fee to meet the original end date. Usage and copyright. When you create an illustration, by default, the copyright belongs to you, the artist. One important thing to remember is that when you create an illustration for a client, you aren't exactly selling the illustration itself, but you are selling the rights to use and reproduce the artwork for a certain period of time. Ideally, you want to retain as much of the rights as possible. The more rights you give to the client, the more value it brings to them. So in this section of the contract, you would indicate what rights you would allow the client to have for this project, and again, be as specific as you can. Here are some things that you might want to cover. How will they use the artwork? For my music festival poster example, is the artwork just for advertising use, or is the client allowed to use that same artwork for brochures and t-shirts? Is the poster for web use, or is it going to be printed as well? Where are they using it? What is the territory? Is this poster only going to be shown in North America, or will it be allowed to be used for like their international festival as well? How long can the client use it for? Can this client reuse this poster for future festivals, or is it only for this specific event? In what quantity can they use the art? For example, is there a limit to how many copies of the poster the client can print out? Does the client have exclusive or inexclusive rights? Am I allowed to license this illustration out to other possible buyers in the future? By indicating the exact usage allowed, if the client ever wants to go beyond what was initially agreed on, like maybe they want to make merchandise in the future, or if they decide that they want to reuse this poster for the next year, they would need to come back to you and negotiate again and pay an additional fee for that new use. You should also state that any usage rights that are not mentioned in the contract would remain with the artist by default, and that the rights are only given if you are fully paid at the end of the project, and as long as the client agrees to the terms in the contract. Obviously, we don't want the client to have control of the art if they just end up going against the contract. So in the contract, it could look something like this. Any usage rights not explicitly stated here are reserved to the artist. Any additional use beyond the expressed use granted will require the arrangement of a separate fee. Client's right to use the work and hold the express grant of rights is conditioned only upon the receipt of full payment and upon the client's compliance to the terms of agreement. So potentially, you could sell all of the rights to the artwork to the client. This is called a buyout or work for hire. But I don't recommend this. If the client owns all of the rights to the artwork, they will be allowed to use it and change it literally however they like without your input for the rest of time. So I do find that a lot of clients don't really understand what it means to buy the artwork entirely. So if a client initially does ask for a full buyout, ideally you want to negotiate out of it and keep the copyright. In most cases, there is literally no reason why a client would need the full rights. However, in some cases, this is just unavoidable, especially if you're working with a really big client or it's an IP project. However, as mentioned in my pricing video, if you do have to give up all of your rights, make sure you are charging an insane amount of money for it, since owning the full art is extremely valuable to the client. Once the work is completed and the payment has been received, the client will own exclusive worldwide rights to the work. Payment. Okay, this is the juicy part. Here you would write down how you're getting paid, how much, and when. So again, as discussed in my previous pricing video, generally there are two ways that you could be paid for your work: value-based or time-based. Time-based is when your payment is determined by how long you work. For example, an hourly, daily, or weekly quote. Client agrees to pay artist $250 per day. For a time-based rate, you should specify the minimum and maximum amount of time you agree to work. Minimum so that you get paid that amount even if you finish early, and maximum so you don't go over your client's budget. Any extra time would have to be discussed with the client first. Client agrees to pay artist $30 an hour for a minimum of 4 hours and a maximum number of 20 hours. Time should not exceed 20 hours without renegotiation and approval from client. Value-based is when you're being compensated for the entire project in a fixed payment that is determined by how much value you're bringing to the client rather than the time. If that's confusing, I cover it more in depth in the pricing video. Client agrees to pay artist $3,000 for the work. For this fixed payment, you could either be paid all at once in a single payment, either before you start working or after you finish your work. If you agree to be paid at the end of the project, there is always the risk that a client will ghost you after getting the art and not pay you at all, especially if you haven't worked with this client before or know how professional they are. In this case, I'd recommend stating in the contract that the client will only receive the final art or the project files after they pay you. Kind of like, you're keeping the art hostage and you have to carefully swap the art for the cash, real slow-like. Artists will deliver final art deliverables to the client only after the artist has received the payment in full. Failure to send final payment within 30 days of invoicing will result in contract termination. Obviously, it's a lot safer for you if you can be paid at the beginning of the project, which is pretty common for commissions and other small jobs. However, if this is a high-paying project, the client likely won't agree to it since it's a big risk on their end as well. Besides being paid in a single payment, you could alternatively decide to be paid in installments, which reduces the risk for both of you. Win-win. So for example, you might decide on 50% of the payment on signing the contract and 50% at the end. Or 25% on signing, 25% on submitting the sketches, and then the last 50% on delivering the final art. With installments, you also have some consistent money coming in throughout the project rather than like a huge lump all at the end. This can be extremely helpful if this is a really long project or if you feel like your freelance work is inconsistent. You then would specify how you want to be paid. Will you expect a wire transfer, check, or PayPal? You don't necessarily need to write this into your contract, but at the very least, this should be discussed and agreed verbally before you start working. And if there are any expenses that come up, like bank transfer charges or PayPal service fees, whether the client pays for it or not. This is especially crucial if you're working with international clients, since transferring money internationally can be very complicated depending on what services are available in both of your countries, and this is definitely something that should be figured out early on. Otherwise, you might end up in a situation where at the end of the project, your client wants to pay you via Zelle transfers or PayPal, but it turns out it's not even available in your location. Depending on where you live and your local laws, you might also need to collect sales tax. Mention that in your quote and whether your tax is inclusive or exclusive to the client's fee. And then finally, when will you get paid? Generally, you would want to see payment completed within 30 days of the client receiving the final art or invoice from you. You can include a late payment fee to make sure your client has consequences if they don't pay you on time. Payment for the work is due within 30 days of final art delivery. Late payments incur a fee of 2.5% per month. Speaking of fees, apart from late payment fees, there are 2 more penalty fees you should consider adding to your contract. Termination of the project. It's really important to lay out a plan for what to do if the project doesn't work out. If your client decides to terminate the project for whatever reason, then they should compensate you for the time and work you've already put into the project. This could be a stage-by-stage system where you are paid a certain percentage of your final payment depending on how much work you've done so far. So for example, 25% of the fee if you've already submitted sketches, 50% if you've completed the color roughs, and so on. And of course, if you've already completed the final artwork, then obviously the client needs to compensate you for 100% of the fee, even if the project was canceled because you did the work. The artist and client have the right to terminate this contract at any point. Client agrees to pay the following cancellation fees within 30 days of notice of project cancellation, at any time and for any reason, before the final art delivery. 25% of the total fee after sketch delivery, 50% of the total fee after color rough delivery, 100% of the total fee is due if the final artwork is complete despite project termination. To keep it simpler, you could instead separate it into 2 payments if you're being paid in installments. Your signing fee would be a non-refundable deposit and act as your kill fee. And again, if you've already completed the work, the client needs to pay 100%. If you are being paid in multiple installments, they could also be non-refundable to compensate you for the work you've done already. In the event of project termination, any deposits already paid to the artist are non-refundable. 100% of the total fee is due if the final artwork is complete, despite project termination. As mentioned earlier, you would also state that if the project is cancelled, the full copyright returns back to the artist. We don't want the client using the work you've done so far without paying you, do we? Upon cancellation, all rights to the work will return to the artist. The client must return original artwork and/or permanently delete all copies of the work, including sketches and concepts, within 30 days of project termination. Revision fee. It's important that you include a revision fee. This will discourage clients from taking advantage of you when asking for multiple needless changes to the illustrations and wasting your time, and also just making sure you're being properly compensated for working overtime. You should mention how many revisions are included within your project fee and how much each additional revision would cost. The client is entitled to 1 round of revisions after the sketch stage and 1 round of revisions after final art delivery. Artists will be compensated $100 for each additional revision if requested by the client. When I say revisions, I usually think of minor changes. However, there are times that the client might ask for a significant change that would essentially be like redoing the whole project. For example, close to finishing the project, the client suddenly decides that they want to change the character style to something more realistic. Because it's such a large request, in that case, you should also say that any major revision requests would need their own negotiated fee that you could determine based on how big of a change they're asking for. For revisions requiring significant change or reflecting a new direction to the project, an additional fee reflecting the workload will be required. And finally, you want to make sure that the client comes to you first for any revisions that they want to make and doesn't make any significant changes to the work without your approval, even after the project is done. There is nothing worse than seeing your artwork out in the wild, but then you find out that the client has messed with the colors or designs to the point that you don't even want to be associated with it anymore because it's so different from your vision. The artist will be given the first opportunity to make any revisions to the work requested by the client. Alterations made to the work are not permitted without approval from the artist. After final art delivery, any alterations requested will require an additional fee. Artist credit and copies. Obviously, you want to be credited for the work you create. It's important that you have your name on the final product so that people know who is behind the lovely artwork and hopefully will contact you for more work in the future. This is a given for any kind of project, but it is especially important if you are working on a work-for-hire job. Because you lose all of your control and you're giving up all of your rights, the client doesn't have to credit you if they don't want to, so you definitely need to have it in writing that you receive recognition. Artwork credit can look different depending on the type of work you're creating, so you'd have to change this depending on the circumstance. For example, a picture book would require artist credit on the front and back cover, and maybe a bio on the inside flap. A chapter book cover might only have credit on the back cover. An editorial illustration would need credit on the article's website, an illustrated product would need credit somewhere on the packaging, and so on. If the project is being promoted anywhere, like if my music festival poster will be featured in a magazine or on their social media or a billboard, I would expect that the client credit me in the marketing too. You'd also have to determine if you are looking for just your name as credit or if you require other information like a link to your portfolio or your social media handle. Artists shall receive name credit on the work, suitable to the context it will be used. If the final work is in print, the client agrees to print the credit clearly on the product. If the final work is digital, the client agrees to publish the credit and include a link to the artist's website, www.coolartist.com, and social media handle when possible. The client will make every effort to include credit to the artist in any promotion of the work. You also want to make sure that you have the right to display the project in your portfolio and social media so you can show off all of the gorgeous work you've done. This is absolutely crucial, especially when you're building your portfolio as a new artist. Otherwise, you'd have nothing to show for all of the hard work you've done. Artist reserves the right to display all contribution to the work, including preliminary sketches, in their portfolio and social media platforms, and to submit the work to design competitions and annuals. And finally, depending on the project, you might also want to ask for complimentary copies of the final product. Whether that's going to be copies of the picture book, the poster, or if the client is using the artwork on several different products. Client agrees to provide artists with 5 sample copies of any printed material. Expenses. In most projects, any expenses that come up would most likely be paid by you and covered by the overall project fee. For some industries, however, you might be able to bill your client for certain expenses that come up, and that should be discussed and agreed on beforehand. This includes things like travel and lodging, shipping and insurance, research materials, models, props, software, and equipment. In the contract, you could include an estimate for each of your expenses and state that the client will repay you for any costs, and any extra expenses not mentioned would need to be approved first. Estimated expenses: travel $500, shipping $250. The client will reimburse the artist for all agreed expenses arising from the project. The artist must obtain written approval from the client for any additional expenses. Original art. I'm primarily a digital artist, so I haven't dealt with this yet, but if you're going to be sending over original artwork to your client, you have to sort some details out. If you're going to be mailing over original art, who's going to pay for shipping and insurance expenses? Does the client keep the artwork, or will it be returned to the artist after they finish scanning it? What happens if the artwork is damaged or is lost in transit? How much is the artwork worth, and will you be reimbursed for it? These are all important questions to keep in mind, so in case the worst happens to your original artwork, you have a plan in place. Non-compete clause. So this isn't something that you would want to include in your contract, but it is something a client might push for, so I thought it would be a good idea to explain it here. Basically, a non-compete clause requires the artist to not make similar work for a different client that could potentially compete with each other, since this could potentially harm your client's sales. This could be something that a client requests that you include in the contract, but ideally you want to negotiate this down to be as small and specific as possible so that it's fairer to the artist. For example, if you were illustrating a board book about Goldilocks and the Three Bears for a client, they might say that you aren't allowed to illustrate any books with other clients about fairy tales for 6 years. However, that restriction is super broad and would prevent you from taking on a lot of possible projects for a long time. Instead, you could negotiate this clause to something more specific, like, artists shall not, without the client's written consent, work on a board book about Goldilocks for a period of 2 years after publication of the work. So you see here, we decrease the length of time and specify the type of book and the exact story. And that's it. Those are my big points on what you should consider including in your next artist contract. Of course, as I said, this is a guideline of some of the important points in a general illustration contract. However, there are a lot of things I missed out related to copyrights and liability and so on that I am just not qualified to talk about. Like I said, I'm an artist, not a lawyer. I would highly suggest looking into other resources, especially if you're going to be working with bigger companies and need those extra protections. So here are a couple of resources that I recommend, which I'll also link below. The Graphic Artist Guild Guide Handbook. This is the holy grail book for all artists, which includes a ton of information on pricing, as well as a big section of legal document examples like cease and desist letters, invoices, and of course, sample contracts. Business and Legal Forms for Illustrators. This is also another fantastic book that includes 25 useful legal forms. Again, this includes contracts. SCBWI. If you are a member of SCBWI, aka the Society of Children's Books Writers and Illustrators, you get access to a wonderful resource called The Book. It's full of all of the information you need to know about the publishing industry. If you are looking for a sample publishing children's book contract, they have one. AOI. If you are a member of AOI, aka the Association of Illustrators, which is a UK-based group, they provide assistance and resources related to contracts, as well as a lot of other information related to the illustration industry. Agents. If you have an illustration or literary agent, you don't have to deal with any of this boring contract stuff, since handling contracts and negotiation is a big part of an agent's job. If you want to learn more about what an agent does and how to get one, I actually made 2 videos which I'll link to below. Once you have written up a draft of your contract, I would highly recommend getting it checked out by an actual lawyer just to make sure everything is covered. Yes, this does cost time and money, but we are talking about your career and livelihood, and your contract should be something that is perfect. Otherwise, you'll actually end up spending even more time and money trying to deal with a project gone wrong because of a bad contract. Before we wrap up, I wanted to answer a couple of questions that were sent to me by my Instagram followers. I'm at Foxville_art, by the way. Let's get to it. What are some red flags to look out for in a contract? So like I mentioned previously, if a client insists that they don't want a contract in place while in this project, that is definitely a red flag. Some clients might phrase it kind of sweetly, saying that, we're all friends here, I trust you completely, you should trust me completely. We don't need a serious old contract, making things so complicated and boring. However, we've already established that a contract is there to protect you. So please don't forget that, always have a contract in place. Especially when you are working with friends and family, since they are honestly the ones who are more likely to pressure you when working or taking advantage of you. If your client wants you to start the project before contracts are fully signed, this is also a red flag. Definitely make sure everything is signed and dotted, totally complete before you start working. Otherwise, if the agreement falls apart for some reason, the client has literally no reason to compensate you for the work that you've done already, and you'll be left with unpaid work that you've wasted your time on. Another red flag, as I've mentioned in my negotiation video, it is really important to have a paper trail and have everything in writing, especially anything verbal like a phone call or a Zoom call. Basically, after every call, you should write down everything that was discussed and email it over to the client just for confirmation of what you guys talked about. So in that vein, if you ever have a client who says one thing in a call and agrees to something verbally only to say something else in the actual contract, that could be a problem. Hopefully, if you bring it up to them, they'll say it was a mistake and they'll change it. However, if they push back or they react badly, it is likely a red flag because that's kind of sus, that's kind of untrustworthy. The second question that I had from my followers is what to do if my client doesn't pay me on time or they break my contract in some way. This is the tough one. With a contract in place, ideally that is deterrent enough to keep the client in check and following the terms that you agreed on, since it is a big, scary document. If for some reason though, the client doesn't pay you on time or they breach the contract in some way, like printing your artwork on merchandise that you didn't agree on, you first need to communicate directly with the client to clear things up. Hopefully this was just a misunderstanding and you both can amicably resolve it and negotiate if needed. However, if the client is refusing to comply with the contract or refuse to pay you, you need to get your contract and gather as much evidence as possible, like email exchanges and phone call transcripts, and just get in touch with a lawyer. Because you have a contract in place, you would ideally have good legal standing in case you would have to go to court. In any case, this is the time to contact an actual professional and go from there. My last question was, what do I do if I signed a contract, but later I want to make changes to it? In the example that I was given by this person had made an agreement to work on an illustration for X dollars. However, a few weeks later, they realized that they were being woefully underpaid, and now they want to see if they can amend the contract to be paid a fairer wage. So in most cases, you can renegotiate the contract after discussing things with your client. Though that is a lot easier to do with things like, the client asking for more revisions or you asking for more sample copies, these like smaller things that you both can likely agree and negotiate on. In this case, it's highly unlikely that the client would agree to increase the fee in the middle of a project after you and the client already agreed and signed the terms. Unfortunately, this is an instance where you kind of just have to accept it and think of this as a learning opportunity. Now you know how much to charge, and if the client comes back with a new project, you can charge them accordingly. But anyway, if you found that this video was helpful, consider giving it a like and subscribe to my channel. I post lots and lots of videos on how to survive the illustration industry and my life as a picture book author and artist. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. I am at Foxville_art, and I also have a Patreon where I post lots of exclusive content. And if you guys are interested, I have a new book that's coming out in a couple of months called That's Not My Name. It's the first book that I wrote and illustrated. It's coming out from Penguin Random House. I have a pre-order link below. If you guys buy it, I will be so happy. It's basically about a little girl who has a uncommon name. She goes to school and she finds out that no one can pronounce it right, which I think is a pretty common experience for a lot of people. Anyway, pre-order link below. Thank you guys so much. But anyway, I hope this was helpful. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!